Alrighty, guys, I am here to do my deep dive into Carl, and this is super exciting. I gotta say that this is one of my favorite parts of being on Team Delusional. Of course, it's difficult to wait years and years for validation, to get a confirmation on a symbol or a theory, but when we do get it, it's in a really big way. And when we get these confirmations, it just validates everything else we've always said. So when it was first leaked that Emily was filming for Dead City in New York, we started seeing the Negan patterns. And if you've been listening to my videos, you've heard me talk about this. A few other people in the fandom have talked about it or mentioned it. So I'm just going to go through the whole thing today so that you can see the sequence, how long it took for it to come together. And again, this just proves everything. It proves um, that they plan everything seasons in advance, that the symbolism we're looking at is real and will be paid off. And, it's just another really compelling, you can't possibly ignore this evidence that Beth will return. So let's just get started. We're going to go through Carl's arc. I usually find it easier to go through the whole thing and then I'll go back and tell you what the symbolism is. Just bear with me for the first part, okay? So we start season 4, which is when we know Gimple took over, right? And I will mention a thing or two that happened before season 4, but most of it is going to be starting in season 4. So in 30 Days Without an Accident, I just want to mention a few things. Um, this really, Carl's arc really does intersect a lot with Rick's arc. I mean, obviously, and I'm not going to go into the details of Rick's arc here. I might just mention it briefly, but we start season 4 with him already protecting Carl in a way that is not entirely healthy. So we have the fact that he kind of became a farmer and didn't want to do all the leadership things, and all of the characters in the first part of the season, you can tell that all of them kind of feel the same way that Carl does, which is that they wish Rick would take up the leadership mantle again, and he just won't. So you have like Daryl inviting him to go on a run, and he comes up with an excuse, and he doesn't want to carry his gun, but Herschel kind of browbeats him into it, that sort of thing. And where this happens with Carl is that the very first thing we see of Carl in this season 4, is that he wakes up and says Rick didn't wake him up early to help. And Rick just says, "Oh, I knew you were up late reading comic books, so I let you sleep." And not that there's anything in particular wrong with that, but he's being protective of Carl in a way that isn't necessarily helping Carl to survive. And you can see sometimes that Carl gets frustrated with him, but he doesn't really say anything. Like most of the other members of Team Family, they're not mean to Rick about it. They're not nasty about it. You can just tell that they are kind of nudging him and wanting him to take this up. And the only reason that's important is that Rick's arc, as long as he's being unhealthy in one direction or another, it actually leads to him losing what he values most. So in this first part, he's actually being too docile and not being enough of a strong leader. Then after the prison falls, we see him taking that to a very extreme opposite, where he's not only being a strong leader, he's being really savage and really violent and shoot first, ask questions later, and all of that kind of stuff. So we just see him waffling back and forth. And I'll mention that a little bit in terms of Carl's arc as we go through. But in this first, I mean, even the whole first part of the fourth season, there's kind of these goofy, for lack of a better word, little things they do with Carl, like him telling Lizzie and Mika not to name the walkers, or him trying to, make a cross for Patrick after he died. And there may well be a lot of symbolism in those things that we could tie into this, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about them. The cross thing is probably important. It's about burying people, burying the people you love, and that can actually tie into Beth quite a bit. But anyway, you get the idea. The only thing, other thing I wanted to mention here, because it will be important later, is in the background you have the sun drawn with chalk on the concrete, and it says Abibel. Back in the day, a lot of TDers tried to figure out what this meant. Abibel, as far as we can tell, is not a word. We have linked it to several things that it is similar to. And if you put this into AI, into today's computers, which I did, it suggests that maybe it's a misspelling of a Bible. But that's not necessarily like a thing people do to misspell a Bible that way. That's just AI thinking that you're spelling it wrong when you put it into the search bar. So it's not really a word, okay? It's not really anything that we can figure out. Only Gimple knows exactly what this means. Okay, I can see it being a reference to a Bible, and they just kind of scrambled the letters to, um, confuse people and suggest something without directly suggesting it. But I think it's really interesting that we see this behind Daryl and Carol because, in conjunction with this whole Carl thing, I've actually had some insight into symbols we've had for a long time, but I've realized things about them that I didn't realize before. So I will go through those as we go through. I think the sunshine literally represents, or this sun, right? The sun symbol, it literally represents what it represents in the song that Carl sings to Negan, which is "You Are My Sunshine." It is the thing that they love the most that is taken away. So that's why I say it's interesting that we see it here directly behind Carol and Daryl because they deal with this, especially in these early seasons like 4 through 6 or 7, more than anyone else does. Okay, because obviously Daryl's sunshine is Beth. Carol's would have been her daughter, but we also see her interacting with other children that are taken away, and it's just her whole motherhood archetype. So it's interesting that we see this behind the two of them specifically. Okay, so the next thing, yeah, I thought I skipped a picture. The next thing that we see, that's really big for Carl is the episode after, which is 409. So the prison falls, Herschel is killed, everything gets bulldozed, Rick gets beat up by the governor, and then it's him and Carl alone on the road for a bit, right? This first part, we basically see them clashing. Carl is angry. He's walking out ahead of Rick. He's really kind of unleashing his vitriol on Rick. The two of them spend a lot of this episode glaring at each other, which is especially frightening on Rick's side because he looks like he went 12 rounds with a brick wall. Eventually, they come to an old barbecue joint, and um, Rick tells Carl to stay outside and he'll clear it. Carl says, "No, I'm going in. You can't hardly stand." So he's really standing up to his dad. They're butting heads. Inside, there's a walker that Rick tries to kill and can't, but he doesn't want Carl to shoot it, and Carl shoots it anyway. So they get mad at each other because of that, that sort of thing. The one thing in here that I wanted to point out that I saw when I was going back through this episode, because this is the only episode I rewatched for this. Most of the others I just reviewed notes and looked over old posts. I do think he pulls pickles off the shelf here. It's hard to see. One of them looks more like relish, while the other one looks more like pickles. But why is that important? Because of the St. Nicholas story. So I'll tie this in later, but if you don't remember, we're not talking specifically about Santa Claus. We're talking about the actual St. Nick. And there is a legend about him that has to do with pickles, in which 3 little boys died and he resurrected them. So pickles tie to a St. Nicholas story, a resurrection story, and we believe that is why they use the whole "I never got anything from Santa Claus" symbol for Daryl. Okay, so we also saw those, interestingly, where the big place that we figured that out and pointed that out had to do with Eugene at the sanctuary. Remember, he was carrying around a jar of pickles for a long time. Eugene is sometimes a proxy to Beth and Daryl, but I also think that probably had a lot to do with Negan. And, it may have had to do with Eugene in the sense that Eugene was kind of instrumental in keeping Negan alive for various parts of the war, when he like would create, he created that device that had music that drew the walkers away from the sanctuary, things like that. And without him, Negan might have died sometime in the war. And so I think it was about keeping Negan alive. And that's important. But the point is, we do see Carl with pickles here. It's really fast. As you can see, this is a little bit blurry. It was hard to get a screenshot of it. So it's like a blink and you miss it kind of symbol. So then what happens is they go into, I don't have pictures of all of this, but they go into the house, and they're still arguing. They're still not happy with each other, but Rick lays down to sleep. Carl sleeps on the floor next to him. The next morning, Carl wakes up, but this is where he can't wake Rick up. Rick goes into this like deep hibernation because he's so injured, and he doesn't wake up for like 36 hours. So when he gets bored, Carl leaves. And actually, there are walkers that he, leads away from the house. Again, I don't have pictures of this, but I have something I'm going to show you afterward in just a minute. He leads them away from the house, and then one of them surprises him. So actually, I think there might be 3. If that's the case, he was leading 2 of them away from the house, and one came up behind him and surprised him. That actually could be an example of the third unseen man, situation that we saw with Rick in the first episode, the pilot episode. He thought there were two people in the car. There was a third unseen man, and that is the man who shot him and put him into the coma. So we might be seeing an example of that with Carl. But in this particular case, he shoots all three of them. At one point, he goes back to the house to talk to Rick and yell at him. I'll get to that in a minute. But he goes into this house. This is the pudding house, right? First thing to point out here is in the kitchen. This is the kitchen where he finds the chocolate pudding. But there's this sign that says Fridag, which means Friday in Swedish, I think, or Norwegian. I can't remember which language it is. There's a lot of people that have suggested maybe this means Good Friday. Now, Good Friday is, according to popular Christian lore, the day on which Christ was crucified. So if this is meant to mean Good Friday, then it suggests Crucifixion Day. So that's interesting. He does find the pudding, but then he goes upstairs. Now, I actually have a picture of this somewhere. I forgot to grab it, but there's a picture of him going up the stairs, and there's a box that says peanut butter on it, which we know peanut butter is a Beth symbol. So this is full of Beth symbols, this particular place. Now, the first thing he does when he gets upstairs, he looks into a room, and this is what he sees. And you guys, this symbol has stumped me in such a big way for so many years. I am so glad that we finally know what it means. So he looks in here, he sees a bird cage, which is open. And we've got the yellow and the pink colors, which are important. We've got an open window, but the bird is dead on the floor in front of the cage. Now, when I first got on TD and I started looking back, I remember finding this at some point and thinking, oh, that's got to be a foreshadow of Beth. It's a bird cage, and there's a bird. And, you could argue, to be devil's advocate, that this suggests Beth is really dead because the bird is dead, right? And I didn't think too much of that. I just kind of went, well, I mean, maybe it's a symbol that Team Family thinks she's dead or that she really did die, but they don't know that she was resurrected. I wasn't bothered too much by that, but it is a point. And even more of a point, probably what I would say now is that even though we see a bird cage in Beth's cell, there's not a dead bird by it. So this is slightly different. Even when we see the bird cage near Connie, right before she disappeared in the later seasons, there was not a dead bird. It was an empty bird cage, right? So this is different. And then, after Carl died, I came back and looked at this and I went, huh, okay. So maybe I was just misinterpreting that particular symbol, and this really was a foreshadow of Carl's death. But it's still weird, because why use this particular symbol for Carl's death that is so close to what they used for Beth? Why use that? And then there's Beth's colors, right? These are not Carl's colors, these are Beth's colors. So it doesn't make complete sense to say it's about Beth, and it doesn't make complete sense to say it's about Carl. But here we have Carl, he's the only one there looking into this room, and what does it all mean, right? Well, I'm going to make you wait a minute, but I'm going to come back to it and explain it. Let's keep going with what happens. When Carl is looking through the rooms, he actually sees quite a few symbols that foreshadow his arc. For example, this eye test that you would see in an ophthalmologist, which is a foreshadow that he's going to lose an eye, right? We even see a radio here, which is interesting. This is long before 509 when we hear the voice on the radio. We also see a guitar, which it looks smaller, like it's a mini guitar, but it looks like the one Beth plays in 509. And we have a baseball bat here, which foreshadows Negan, okay? All really important symbols. Eventually, he opens the door to the bathroom. You can tell because this is a shower curtain here. And this walker comes out at him and surprises him. Now, I honed in on this walker a long time ago because at one point, Carl shoots him in the head and it doesn't kill him. Now, if you watch really closely, I think Carl's aim was just a little bit off, especially because the walker was moving and they were wrestling. And I think he just grazes the side of the head, so he just doesn't hit the walker in the brain. He maybe takes off its ear or something. But the thing is, when he shoots it, it goes down as though it was killed, and it's obvious that he thought he got it, and then it jumps back up, and he's like, oh, because he has to fight it again, okay? So I always thought of that as, okay, we have an example of him shooting something in the head, but it doesn't die. So I was connecting that to Beth, right? Now, this could also, you could argue, be a foreshadow of Carl, because later on in season 6, Carl is also shot in the head. He's shot in the eye, and he doesn't die, right? So you could see it as Beth symbolism. You can also see it as Carl foreshadow. So this is what happens, and I'm sorry these are so small. Let me make this bigger. He goes into this room. Now, we have been harping on this room since at least season 7, because everything in this room has a nautical theme, okay? So you can see that there are boats and boat symbols, like what do you call this? The wheel on the boat here. You see them all over the room. And so when Oceanside came into play, we thought that maybe there were so many symbols that felt like Beth symbols around Oceanside, right? And I wondered if the nautical theme in this room foreshadowed Oceanside, and therefore we thought Beth would come through Oceanside. Now she didn't. But I realize now that what the nautical theme in this room is foreshadowing, Oceanside was also foreshadowing. They were two foreshadows of the same thing that hadn't happened yet. And I believe what the nautical theme is about going across the ocean, the fact that Daryl crossed the ocean. And we don't know exactly how or when or if that's going to lead to Beth, but I think that they knew that there would be a crossing of the ocean at some point. It could have specifically been for Daryl, or it could have just been that they knew Beth was taken across the ocean, so there would be some sort of storyline about leaving, and not just taking a plane, but leaving via ship, right? It's something about the ocean. So I think Oceanside foreshadowed that, and so did this. Um, okay, then we have he's still fighting with this walker, right? And you can see other things in this room. You can see this, these are like the portholes of a ship. There are ships on here. Again, nautical theme, yellow bat, Negan, color yellow. You get the idea. And I thought I had a picture of this, but at some point, I do believe Carl loses his hat. It falls off his head and he puts it back on. Now, you can see I was pointing out the pirate theme here, but the biggest thing here is that this walker almost gets him, almost bites his leg, and it takes off his shoe. Now, that's really important. And look at the way that they make sure that we know this. Not only does it show him without the shoe, but we've got yellow scissors also tying him to Beth. Okay? But he gets away, skin of his teeth, outside the door. Now, notice that this says Sam. That's another thing that we have been trying to figure out for a long time. So this is where Carl writes the note on the door that says, you know, Walker inside, got my shoe, didn't get me, that sort of thing. I'm going to come back to this because I realized something about both the shoe symbolism and the Sam symbolism while I was doing this. But after this, Carl goes and eats the pudding. Then he goes back to Rick. Now we have a part where it is nighttime and Rick starts breathing really funny. So I said before that at one point he goes home to Rick and it's when Rick is still out. And Carl yells at him and screams at him and says, you know, that he's useless and he should have protected everyone and everyone was counting on him. And then he ends by saying, I'd be okay if you died. I remember when this aired and people had so much to say about that, about what a punk Carl was being. But I mean, it's not even so much that he's being a punk. He's a teenage boy who's dealing with his trauma, right? He thinks he just lost his little sister who died and a lot of other people he cared about. He thinks they all could be dead. And then there's the fact that he's a teenage boy and this is his dad. So of course his dad's going to get the blame, you know. It's actually very sad. But in this part, Rick starts breathing funny and Carl thinks he might have died. And tries to shoot him, but then he says he can't. And the interesting thing about this is that if you think about it, he drops the gun, he says, I can't, and then he says, I was wrong, and he starts to cry, and only then does Rick speak, which makes Carl realize that he's actually not dead. So we have an example of Carl, I mean, all of the anger and ego, and I can do it on my own. I mean, that was just him. Again, it's a trauma response, but it's also him trying to have bravado. And it's like I feel like this whole episode was Carl coming into himself and realizing that this egotistical, nose in the air, I can survive on my own thing, it's really not authentic to him and it's not going to work for him. And after this, he actually becomes a lot more like Beth. He becomes a lot more mellow and level-headed, and he's the one often bringing Rick back down to reality, that sort of thing. So that's kind of what this was about, is him processing his trauma and then kind of becoming the person he's going to be for the rest of the series. But it's interesting that he had to drop the bravado and say, I was wrong, and actually feel the emotions that he was feeling. You know, he starts crying and actually letting these emotions out, and only then did Rick speak. So it's just kind of an example of, after the trial of your faith will come the miracle kind of a thing. So I thought that was really, really interesting. All right. So after that, Rick does wake up. They have a heart-to-heart. Michonne shows up, and then they're all together, and the season continues. After that, the only other big thing that I want to talk about here, of course, he's with Rick and Michonne, plenty more scenes with him. They go into Terminus together, but I want to talk about some of the flashbacks, important flashbacks from A, which is 416. The first one we see has to do with Patrick. Patrick is playing with these Legos, and Rick goes into Carl and uh, it says, I want you to come with me to learn farming, basically. And during this part, we do see Beth, and that's important. So again, if we're looking at the entire arc for Carl, remember that really and truly, well, let's just mention all of it. Season two, Carl arc was getting shot, and I'll just mention that a little bit at the end here. Season three, at the end of season three, we saw him become very callous, where he shot that boy that was with the governor, and even Herschel was very, very worried about how callous Carl had become. So that is actually the reasoning behind why Rick wouldn't let him have his guns and was trying to teach him to be a farmer, because he was trying to restore Carl's humanity. And to his credit, I think he did that, but he also, even once it was restored, he didn't go back to a more level-headed teaching him how to survive and being a leader, right? So he almost took it to too much of an extreme. So what we saw here is Rick, the first time Rick went to Carl and said, I want you to come learn farming with me. It's important that we see Beth here because it is this that's going to lead to the biggest part of what I'm saying and what links Beth and Carl. So we have an example of Carl being very callous. He starts to learn to farm, but that anger comes out again in after. And then we see him finally let it go for good. And, like I said, become the person that's more kind, that's more hopeful, that's more level-headed, that he's going to be for the rest of the series. And that is going to lead to Beth returning, specifically Carl becoming that person. Okay. So that's why I think it showed her here. This was the beginning of that. Rick just saying, Carl, come on, I want you to come with me, leave your gun. We're going to go learn farming. But we see Beth there taking care of baby Judith, and that is a hint. So then we have this scene that Team Delusional in particular has analyzed to death, right? What happens in the scene? Carl's learning to farm. His hat falls off. Now, I mentioned that it falls off in the room, I'm pretty sure, when he's fighting that walker. The hat falling off is a really important symbol, okay? So the biggest thing, of course, that we have analyzed this scene about is the fact that Rick, after the hat falls off, puts it on Beth and says, there's a new sheriff in town. And we have always seen that as a suggestion that she'll come back as a leader. Now, she may still come back as a leader, but I'm not sure that's actually what that means. When Carl died, because of course, when we were first analyzing this, we didn't know Carl was dying. Like, I didn't know Carl was dying. I wasn't watching Carl's arc, so I didn't have a whole lot of interest in it. And I didn't know he was dying until, I think we knew it a few months before it happened because other people figured it out. We're looking at things and saying, we think they might be killing off Carl this year. And then once they said that, and I actually sat down and looked at the arc, I went, oh, you know what, you guys? They're right. He's going to die. And I laid it out, and sure enough, that was true. So I didn't catch it, but once I was told it and then looked at the symbolism, yeah, it made sense. The symbolism lined up for it. So what I said at that point was that maybe the point of the hat in this scene was that, Carl, being Rick's son, was going to be the kind of the heir to Rick's mantle as leader. And because Carl was dying, and of course, no one in the audience knew that at this point, but the writers did. Gimple did. We are seeing the hat falls off Carl, which signifies his death. Okay, and then Rick puts it on Beth because she will actually be the heir to Rick's leadership mantle. Okay, that's kind of the way I was interpreting it. Now, that may or may not be true because Carl did die, but there's another element to it, right? So we see her with the hat on here. Now we're going to skip to season 5. And once again, I'm going to go back and tell you what all this means, but let's just get through what I actually have to say here. Of course, the biggest thing for Carl in season 5 where Beth is concerned is that he gives Maggie the music box. If you've heard my origin story for what I thought and how I started my account and everything, the music box is key because when I was watching this episode, it was immediately obvious to me that the music box represented Beth, right? It is something that made music, and Carl says it's broken. Beth made music, and broken just represents her being shot, right? She being hurt. And of course, Maggie thinks she's dead, but we don't. But I do remember wondering more than once, why Carl? I might have even asked people this question. Does anyone have any insight on this? Why Carl give it to her? Why not Daryl give it to her? Or Rick, or Carol, or Tyrese, or Sasha, or anybody else? We all know that Gimple does things for a reason, that he's very specific. So why Carl? And we didn't know. I don't know. Who cares? Why Carl? We just knew that he did, but we didn't have any insight into that. Now, I'm going to skip mostly over the next few seasons, but I just want to point out that Carl ends up taking on a lot of roles that we can link to Beth or that she used to have. So he becomes baby Judith's protector a lot of the time. As I've already said, he believes in good people. He has a lot of hope. He tends to keep Rick more grounded. So, for example, this was in season 5 before Coda, when he finds the thing written on the outside of Gabriel's church that says, "You'll burn for this." He tells Rick about it and he says, "Look, I don't know what this means, but whatever it is, it's going to be okay. We're going to figure it out. So don't freak out about it, but you did need to see it." And that's just very much what he does. He's very calm, he's very logical. He's not brutal like Rick is, and he's not someone who freaks out and is afraid, right? Um, of course, he also is shot in the head. So, like Beth, he is shot in the head and survives. So, there is that. In season 7, we see him go briefly to the sanctuary and hang out with Negan. And Negan makes him sing "You Are My Sunshine." Now, remember in the beginning, I talked about the sunshine on the wall of the prison and how I think it represents what is taken away from them. Now, it's important to note that Carl singing this song to Negan is something that happened in the comic books, okay? So it was something that, it's not something Gimple made up. However, it's actually a little bit odd to me that it played out so similarly as it did to what it did in the comic books. Because usually Walking Dead, the TV show, remixes things and makes it their own. Now, I'm sure there were differences into how this played out and exactly what happened with Carl and Negan, as compared to the comic books. I haven't read them. I'm sure there are differences, so it wasn't exact. But it would have been more, um, I don't know, more, I can't think of the phrase. I want to say in character, but we're talking about the writers. It would have been more common to what they do to actually give this song to someone else. Because that's usually what they do, right? They change things, they give it to someone of a different gender, they give it to a different character, all of that, and they actually still kept it fundamentally the same by having Carl sing this to Negan. So why is that? Well, I think there's, a very good reason for it that does have to do with Beth and how they are entwined. So again, I will come back to that. Now, in season 8, Carl saves Sadiq, and this is where he's bitten. We know this. Um, what happens is Negan attacks Alexandria, starts lobbing bombs and fireballs over the wall. And at the end of this episode, we learn that Carl has been bitten for sure. So this is not a good picture. Again, I remember trying to get a picture of this, but see, what happens is he's up here on the scaffolding and then he jumps down, like he goes down the ladder and kind of falls because he's already very weak from having been bitten. The virus is already, he's got a fever, he's not doing well. When he hits the ground, the hat falls off of him. And so once again, it's a very obvious symbol, and the hat fell off and they very obviously showed him pick it up and put it back on. But the point is the hat falling off is a symbol of his death, right? That he is not going to continue to be around and to be Rick's right hand anymore. And then we have this, the symbol of the phoenix. And once again, this was something that really boggled us when it happened, because I saw it and I went, that is a freaking phoenix. It's even on fire. And Carl was bitten on the abdomen, which means it's not something they can cut off. And, by this point, it had been hours since he'd been bitten, so it was probably too late anyway. So clearly, Carl can't come back from that. But a phoenix is about resurrection, resurrection, rising from the ashes and coming back to life. And so I was going, okay, this has to be about Beth somehow, but I have no idea why or what it means. And I think at the time we were thinking, okay, well, maybe we'll see her at the end of season 8, or maybe All Out War somehow will lead to her. Now, clearly it didn't. That didn't happen. But again, we just couldn't figure out what it meant. We knew it had to have something to do with Beth, but we didn't know how to explain it, right? And that's hard. That's where we get a lot of hate from the skeptics, because they're like, oh, that doesn't even make sense. And we're like, yeah, we know, but we still think that's true. We just can't explain why. Okay, so then what happens? Carl dies, and one of his dying wishes is that Rick not kill Negan. Remember, we had this whole weirdo, people thought it was a flashback, they thought it was a flash forward, where Rick wasn't, I called it Rick's old man coda. We saw Judith being older than she was at the time because she was still a baby when this was going on. And as it turned out, it was just Carl's vision of the future where Negan was redeemed and actually became part of the um, community, right? And we even specifically had Judith, taking a liking to him and, being kind with him and laughing with him. And now, where we sit in the present, we can see that all of that has actually come true. Negan was redeemed. He was in jail for a long time. But there was a lot of interaction between him and Judith. He saved her more than once. She saved him. She let him go at one point. So this, even though it doesn't look exactly like Carl's vision, it's fundamentally it's come true. Now, the really important thing about this is that Rick only allowed Negan to live because Carl asked him to. I mean, Rick didn't really want Negan to live, right? I mean, Negan killed Glenn and Rick loved Glenn, but Rick was not able to save Carl, and because it was Carl's dying wish, he spared Negan. I 100% believe that if Carl had not died, if Carl had survived the war, Rick would not have spared Negan. Okay. So it's really important that there's this cause and effect thing going on where because Carl died, Rick spared Negan. Because Negan is still alive, he's probably going to have something to do with bringing Beth back. Okay. Okay, so now let's go back through and I will let you know what I'm seeing here. I think I talked about the beginning pretty well. The biggest thing there is that we see Carl making the cross for Patrick, which is, I mean, we could tie that into burying people, burying the ones you loved, which is a Beth theme. We have this Abibel, which again is, what they lose. So I'll talk about that more when we get to the Negan part again. We've got the pickles, which I already showed you. Now, here's one of the bigger things that has less to do with Beth, but to me just shows that this was planned. So, and I pointed this out not too long after Carl died is when I found this. So I said that he led some walkers away and then one of them surprised him, right? And he ends up in this position here. This is from 409. It's a screenshot from when he's fighting those walkers. So he's on his back on the ground and the walkers kind of, looming over him, trying to get him, trying to eat him. And then we saw something, the exact same shot, though of course he's older, he's got the eye patch, but it's the exact same shot. And this is from 806, which is when Carl was bitten. Now we aren't told that he was bitten until 808, but he went out to save Sadiq, and we have the shot, and this is where he was bitten, and so what leads to his death. So what that tells me is that this, with him wrestling with these walkers, is a direct foreshadow of his death, which just means that when Gimple was putting together this episode, 409, after, he already knew that Carl was going to die. He was already planning for it, and this doing a similar shot is how they linked those two episodes together and told us that this was a payoff of this foreshadow. Okay, that's important. I'm going to talk more about how I know that one thing is foreshadow of another in just a minute. So there's the pickles. Then we get into the house where he sees this. So what does this mean now? Once again, if what happens is that Negan somehow brings Beth back, then what that means is that so you've got to understand the sequence here. Because Carl died, Negan lived. That is the only reason Negan was spared at the end of All Out War. And because Negan lived, he will bring Beth back to Maggie and, by extension, back to everyone else. So this is why we have this symbol. It is meant to mean Beth. And I think that, by extension, the bird does mean Carl because it's Carl who will die, not Beth, right? But it's like the death of one will bring about the other. So we have this mixture of symbols. And, you could even argue that there's a window here, a way out. I mean, maybe they're going for there were two birds and one got away and one didn't. There's really no way to know for sure if that's what they're going for. But suddenly the symbol is making sense. Like I said before, it wasn't making sense for it to be wholly about Beth. It wasn't making sense to be wholly about Carl. But the two of them together, suddenly that makes sense, right? We have the stuff he found, which, the eye thing because he loses his eye, the bat thing because he will have an arc with Negan, although there could be other reasons that him and Negan are important. But what about the guitar? If we're just foreshadowing Carl's stuff here, why would they have the guitar? He never plays a guitar. He doesn't touch a guitar. He's not, in Tyrese's hallucination, when Beth plays the guitar, this is specifically foreshadowing Beth. And if we look at this radio, that to me specifically foreshadows um, 509, which is Tyrese's death, where Beth was in his hallucination, because this actually looks a lot like the radio that's in 509. Okay, so of course, a lot of this is pointing to Carl's future arcs, but we're also entangling other symbols that are important, right? Um, Not too much to say about this. I think I already said that. It could be Beth, it could be Carl. Either way, he was shot in the head, and got back up, the walker, I mean. Here, one thing I didn't mention is Carl's trying to go out the window and he can't because it's stuck. So that could be part of the no escape. Remember, there was a no escape sign, or no exit, excuse me, no exit sign in Beth's cell. And he can't go out the side window. He has to go back out the door, which means he has to fight his way past the walker. So that's a symbolism that I've talked about with the doors, back door, side door, a few times recently. I talked about him losing his hat here and the bat here. Okay, let's talk about the shoe thing. So this is what I realized about the shoe symbolism. I've said for a long, long time that the missing shoe, or sometimes it's a missing foot that gets, disconnected, especially if it's a walker. I've always said that that represents two people being separated for a long time, and eventually a reunion will follow. We did see a shoe with Beth. It was near the tracks in Inmates when she was with Daryl. So that's what really made me figure it out, was looking at that shoe. But I started to see it other places too. Um, we do see a very obvious example of it in 712, which is when Rick and Michonne are at the carnival, and it foreshadows him being taken into the CRM. That's when he has a little mini death fake out, right? And in that case, it's not his shoe. He's trying to pull a walker off a car, and the walker's whole foot comes off in his hand. But it's very obviously like a disembodied foot and a disembodied shoe. So those kind of line up because the shoe for Beth represented her being separated from Daryl. The shoe for Rick represented him being, taken into the CRM and separated from the group. But there are other instances that didn't make as much sense. One that still pretty much followed that pretty well was in Fear the Walking Dead with Al and Isabel. When they first met, one of them, they were running through a bog, and one of them left a shoe behind in the mud. Um, and then what happened, if you didn't watch that, is they had kind of a still episode where they connected romantically, and they were going to run away together. But the CRM was looking for them. And so Isabel ends up basically turning herself in and going back into the CRM. And so because of that, Al and Isabel are separated, right? They couldn't be together, even though they were both okay. They were unable to build a life together because uh, Isabel went back into the CRM, which lines up very well with Rick being taken into the CRM, and one of the reasons we think Beth may be there for some part of her arc. But there were other ones. The one that really kind of stumped me was Spencer. And I think I went over this pretty recently when I did the Operation Lead the Walkers Away deep dive. But there's a part where he tries to get out of Alexandria in season 6 when there's still a ring of walkers outside the Alexandria gates. And he almost falls and to his death, and Tara helps save him. And anyway, they bring him back in, but he loses his shoe. And I was going, okay, Spencer's not a main character. He's not even very well liked, and he loses a shoe here, and it very obviously and intentionally shows that. That's got to be part of the lost shoe symbolism, but there was not really a time when Spencer was separated from anyone, especially someone he was like romantically involved with, and so that didn't make sense, and I didn't know how to tie that in. It seems like there was another example too, but I can't remember all of them. Anyway, you get the idea. But I actually realized something here while I was watching this episode with Carl. So, as I said before, the walker came real close to biting him, right? And what did he have to do to get away? He had to let go of his shoe. And that's what helped him get away because the walker grabbed the shoe instead of him. And then he was able to basically kick out of his shoe and get away. So, what I'm thinking now is that the lost shoe actually represents something that is sacrificed so that someone else can escape and live. And I want you to think about it that way. We've said many times that we think that Beth's getting shot may have saved Team Family in some way. We don't know the details of that. We don't know for sure because we don't have the missing 17 days, but I really strongly believe that's true. And Team Family may not even realize it. Maybe they did. Maybe they realize it. I mean, we don't know what they know and what they didn't know about Grady and the CRM and what was going down back then. They may be in complete ignorance, or we might find out that during the missing 17 days that they did know. I don't know. But I do think that Beth getting shot that way actually probably saved everyone else from dying, whether they know it or not. Um, with who else did I say? Oh, well, we have Rick going into the CRM. When it happened, he blew up the bridge because there was a huge, huge horde of walkers heading toward the community where his family was. So, being on the bridge, you could say he kind of sacrificed himself and also all the work they'd done on the bridge so that people could live. With Al and Isabel, I mean, Al or Isabel, excuse me, kind of sacrificed herself, but it was so that Isabel could get away, and so the CRM didn't take her. With Spencer, it's not so much about a relationship, but if you remember, Negan killed Spencer. And in a way, you could say that Negan was looking to kill somebody, and Spencer was sacrificed so that nobody else was killed in that episode. So it kind of works across the board. And I think that that might be a more specific definition of the symbol of the lost shoe. It's what is lost so that other people can live. And that, it's even more compelling to me then that we have this pair of yellow scissors here, because that definitely foreshadows Beth, right? Something about the scissors and the color yellow and her being sacrificed so that others can live. Then we have this Sam situation, right? So there are three instances of Sam that I know of. Let me know if I'm missing any. There's this one, which is just the name on the door. It's probably the name of the kid who lived in the room, and we don't see him. But then there is the Sam that Rick and Carol meet in the Apple House. That happens during season 4, so it's before this. It's like, is it Indifference? It's during 4A that they meet those two. And then that guy appears again at Terminus, right, and is killed there. And then, of course, we have Jesse's son, whose name is Sam, who dies in the same episode where Carl is shot in the eye, actually. So, because I was thinking about the shoe situation, I think it's similar with Sam. I don't think it's exactly the same, but it's similar. I think Sam is the name of the person who dies in any given situation, and their death. It's not so much that it's a sacrifice, like that couldn't necessarily apply to all the Sams, but it's like the person who dies, and that gives Team Family just enough time to figure things out. So it's kind of a sacrifice, but it's not like being self-sacrificial, and it's not something that is sacrificed on purpose. So here, for example, Sam represents, that the shoe gave Carl the opportunity to get away from this walker. With the Sam from the Apple House who is killed at Terminus, if you remember, you had the guys from our group, which was Rick, Darrell, Bob, and Glenn, and they were lined up on one side of the trough, and then you had 4 other guys that we didn't know that were lined up on the other side of the trough, but one of them was Sam, and Sam was the first one killed. But it's like, if the termites had started with the other side of the trough, all 4 of our characters would have been killed. But once the first 4 were killed, it was then that Carol blew up the gas main, whatever it was, and that gave them the opportunity to live and to survive. You see what I mean? So Sam is the person who died, which gave them the opportunity they needed to figure things out and live. And then you could say the same thing about Jesse's son. Again, it doesn't really feel like a sacrifice, but he freaked out and he died. But the rest of them survived. Also, let's see. I guess in terms of this example with Carl and of Jesse's son, you could always argue that it's tied into Beth's arc somehow because we have the symbolism here, and then because Carl is shot specifically due to the sequence that began when Sam was killed there. Um, I don't know that we have a really concrete way to say the same thing about Terminus, but many of us suggest that there's a lot of things about Grady and Terminus that we don't currently know. So there may be some way to tie them into her arc in a similar way once we do know those things. Anyway, kind of spitballing there, but you get the idea. All right, so then what happens? Let's see. I talked about, oh, okay. So I already pretty much talked about this one and how, again, if he's going to ask Rick to spare Negan, and Negan brings her back, then this moment when he is going to start being peaceful and become the person that he's going to be, That's going to lead to Beth's resurrection and coming back. Because think of it this way, as brutal as he was being in season three, if he was still that brutal during All Out War, he would have been like, yeah, screw Negan, kill him. You know what I mean? Like he wouldn't have been that kind peacemaker of a person who would have asked Rick to spare Negan. And we were kind of seeing that whole arc in miniature in the episode after, because we see him first being really brutal and angry, and then we see the kind of this cathartic moment where he processes his trauma, and then he becomes peaceful again. So it was like we were seeing a full representation of his arc within that one episode. And because he was peaceful, he asked that Rick spare Negan, and because Rick spares Negan, we believe that will be how Beth finds her way back to the group. So again, here I talked about how I was thinking that um, the hat being put on Beth is not only that she might be a leader, um, but it could be that she's going to take the mantle. But now we have yet another really interesting tie, and it's that something about the hat falling off Carl, which represents his death. Remember, I told you how right before he died, his hat fell off. So it was very obvious that that is representing, it's kind of like his quote unquote downfall, which is his death. And then it gets put on Beth, which shows that because Carl dies, aka the hat falling off him, Beth will return, right? Now we also know why he gives Maggie the music box. Think of it this way. In this episode, he's giving Maggie a gift of the music box to remind her of Beth, right? The reason they're having him do it is because he is going to give Maggie Beth back indirectly, right? Because he asks that Negan be spared and Negan brings Beth back. Carl, through his death, is giving Maggie back the gift of her sister. That's what this represents. Okay. These are the ways he's a lot like Beth, right? All of these, and we've said this throughout the years that this is a foreshadow of Beth, and people say, oh, you're reading too much into it. This is just about Carl. Yeah, not so much. I believe this is why they had him still sing the song to Negan. Again, it was in the comic books, so this is not something Gimple made up, but he made use of it, right? He could have given that to somebody else and done a different remixed version of it, which is what they usually do for the show, but it just worked perfectly to have Carl do it because he's singing about the sunshine that is lost. I mean, okay, you guys, I actually have, and I will put it in the show notes. I have a video edit that I did um, to the song "You Are My Sunshine." That's a really sad version of the song, and we usually sing that as a pretty happy song because we only sing the first verse. But if you sing all the verses, it's really depressing. And anyway, so I did a video edit of that with Beth and Daryl clips. But anyway, I mean, in essence, Carl is singing about losing the thing you love the most, right? You could tie that into Negan's arc. As I said, you can tie it into Daryl and Carol. Daryl because he lost Beth, Carol because she's lost the children she's taken care of. Um, and I started talking about Rick's arc at the beginning, and I'm going to go over this a little bit more. I'm going to show you a conversation that me and Galadriel Jones had to hash this out a little bit. But Carl is Rick's sunshine, right? He's the person that Rick was always the most focused on. I mean, yes, Judith too, but Judith was a baby, because they're both men, because Carl was older. He had such a strong bond with Carl. After Carl was shot, we see that scene where Rick is crying, hoping that Carl will survive and saying, I want to show you the new world. I mean, everything about Rick was focused on Carl. And when Carl dies, that's taking away Rick's sunshine, right? So it is a foreshadow of his death. But my point is that because Rick was not being very healthy about things, from the time that the prison fell until Carl died, Rick remained pretty brutal about things and pretty savage-minded. And you could actually argue that that led to Carl's death. Okay, I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. But the point is, this is why they kept it this way. Number one, it makes sense for Carl to sing this. It definitely is about Beth, but it's about everyone who's losing what is most important to them. And then there's the fact that he's singing it to Negan. And so if we have this sequence of, Carl saves Negan, Negan saves Beth, then it just makes sense. Like, why would they change that? It goes perfectly with what they're going for. So I've been over this, where the hat falls. Okay, guys, We have this phoenix, yeah? And we didn't know what it meant, but it jumped out at me in a big way. Tell me that this does not look like this. Yes, this has more of a American flag, red, white, and blue kind of theme to it, but it's the exact same uh, position, I guess, for the bird, with its tail feathers facing down, its head up, and its wings spread out with almost like a straight line across the top, right? This is what we see. There's no way that that is not a correlation. This one just happens to be on fire. So this is what they're trying to show with this phoenix, right? We see the hat fall off Carl, and he picks it up, puts it back on, and it's just a minute or two later, like a couple of shots later, that we see him looking at this phoenix. Okay, so what they're trying to say is that because Carl dies, a phoenix will rise from the ashes. And even when I saw this and noticed this, I couldn't figure it out. I was going, okay, but again, Carl's not coming back. So, I figured it had to do with Beth, but what does this mean? What does it all mean? You guys, that was in season 8, and it has not made sense until now when we realize that Beth is going to be in Dead City. Okay. So we had 11 seasons of the show, and now we've had two of Dead City going on three, and three of Daryl Dixon going on four. So it's taken that long for this to really come full circle and us to understand what it means. Okay. Oh, I just wanted to throw this in. This is obviously not my edit, but I found it something that I'd saved. And that is that Gimple did have him get bitten in the same place he was shot in season 2. So that's what we like to call, me and my fellow theorists, we call it, we say Gimple is mining for symbolism. He was working on the show in season 2, but he was a junior writer. He did craft Beth's entire season 2 suicide arc by himself. But I don't think that he necessarily, or that any of the writers necessarily, had Carl get shot there because they knew that Carl would die and get bitten there. It's more that when Gimple took over and decided that Carl was going to die, he went back and looked and said, okay, we're going to have him get bitten in the same place because it feels so cohesive that way. And it's almost like him getting shot in season 2 was a foreshadow of when he would actually die. Again, not because they actually knew that during season 2, but you could argue that because they have gone back and looked through those early episodes and made the symbolism line up so perfectly, right? So this is a big deal. Now what I want to do, let's see, I don't know if there's anything else I need to say here. I don't think so. I'm going to show you. So first of all, in the last video, I answered an ask where they talked about something Maggie says in Dead City. So let's go to that. Okay, so this is from Season 1, Episode 6 of Dead City, and Maggie said, for me, it wasn't the Statue of Liberty, it was Macy's. When I was little, after my mom got sick, I'd crawl into bed with her and she'd tell me stories about Santa. The real Santa. Sometimes he'd come down to the North Pole to the Macy's store in Manhattan and visit all the kids. And I'd used to daydream that one day I'd go to New York, walk into that Macy's, become friends with the real Santa. He'd take all the toys that I'd lost or had been broken and he'd find a way to replace them. So I did talk about this a little bit before, but there's so many things that are being pulled together here. There's the Christmas symbol, there's the Saint Nick symbol, which includes resurrection and the pickles. There's Daryl's I never got nothing from Santa Claus. But the real thing that jumps out at me here is what this Nani capitalized, which is lost and broken. She lost Beth, of course. She lost Glenn. But when Carl gave her the music box, it was broken. It was like a broken toy. And then Daryl fixed it. Now, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but I did say before, so I'm repeating, that, Negan might be trying to replace Glenn, the fact that she lost him because of Negan's actions, by bringing her Beth. And in 510, which is called Them, the music box was broken and then it wakes up again, right? So it just all fits really well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a part of a conversation so that we can hash out a few more details and you can see what my fellow theorists have contributed here. Okay, so WD Wave says, I just finished your video and I absolutely loved how your one person mentioned from DC Maggie's wish that she discussed with Negan about Santa Claus, broken toys, and the Statue of Liberty. Oh my gosh. It just shows that this AU dream that we'll be seeing was planned years ago, and I love that, and I'm so excited for Dead City 3. So the other thing I was going to say is that, and I didn't go into it too much, but just if you look at Carl's arc, it's very clear that it was planned from the beginning, right? Seeing the death shot both times, again, means that they knew Carl was going to die back when they were filming planning and filming and writing season four, which also means that they knew all about Beth's arc. And we've proven that various ways already. You know, the fact that she walks into the mannequin hand that looks just like her arm when it falls on the ground in Coda. So it doesn't make sense to say that they suddenly decided to kill her off in episode 7 of season 5. This has got to be proof that they have planned all of this and that it takes years to pay that off sometimes, right? So then Galadriel Jones says, okay, I just finished the video. I want to add to Anne's excitement over the rediscovery of that line from Maggie. I'd totally forgotten about that. So thank God for our community, which is just massively engaged at the moment. This leads into a couple of things I wanted to add pertaining to Carl. As I know you said you're working on a Carl deep dive. My rewatch of season 2 has yielded a few interesting things about Carl and how he seems to be an early proxy for Beth, and then later how he becomes a narrative vessel for Beth's return, possibly via Negan. So Carl gives Maggie the music box, which is a broken toy. In the quote from DC, Maggie says, and I'd used to daydream that one day I'd go to New York, walk into that Macy's, become best friends with the real Santa. He'd take all the toys that I'd lost or that had been broken, and he'd find a way to replace them. The other thing, guys, sorry, quick aside, is that remember that when she says the real Santa, I mean, in the context of what she's talking about, it's a little kid saying, not a department store Santa, but the real Santa who lives at the North Pole, right? But another way you could interpret the real Santa is the real Saint Nick. And the real Saint Nick resurrected people, and there's pickles involved. Okay. So that's actually kind of a way of saying that the way in which he's going to replace the lost or broken toys is through resurrection via the original Saint Nick. Okay. So Maggie received a broken toy from Carl, symbolic of Beth. This quote foils that for me as it points out that the music box is broken. It's not dead. We learn this when Daryl fixes it. This is speculation, but Daryl fixing the music box seems to proxy him as Santa Claus here, which is an excellent point. Maybe it's silly, but there have been lots of rumors, pure rumors, that maybe Norman will actually be there in the AU scene. Maybe he'll be dressed up as Santa. Maybe he'll be dating Beth. Maybe this is how they will reintroduce the audience to the idea that Beth and Daryl had a romantic spark before he lost her. This also came up in your video today. Did any of Team Family know or realize what was going on? Truly, did Daryl ever open up to anyone? An interesting question for the powers that be to answer here. Anyway, so Carl is yet again part of this broken toy, which is found, gifted to Maggie, and then fixed. Also, there's a little moment with Carl in season 2. I want to say maybe it's also in Chupacabra, but I will need to go back and forth and see for sure. Carl is talking to his dad about how um, now they've both been shot, and this is the moment when Rick decides to let him wear his hat, or something like this. Like it's getting shot that anoints him as the sheriff. In an unspecified flashback, Carl then drops the hat, and Rick tells him he needs a gardening hat. He gives the hat to Beth and calls her the new sheriff in town. She is later shot. I think probably Gimple drew from this moment with Carl rather than intentionally here. It was very oblique, and it would take a close watching audience a minute to go back and find it with all the correct context in mind, but we exist, Team Delusional, LOL, so here we are. I will go back and find that scene just in case you want to add it to your Carl deep dive. You may be done with it though. In any case, it's still interesting. I feel it's like as an early proxy for how wearing the sheriff's hat is a clear representation for surviving a near-fatal gunshot wound. Judith is also shot and survives by the skin of her teeth in season 11 while wearing the hat. Wearing the hat makes you the sheriff, but you're not really the sheriff until you've survived what Rick survived in Days Gone By, which is the pilot episode. So then I answered and I said, thanks for the info. I was actually getting ready to record this as she sent this to me. I'm definitely going to mention that stuff. I don't think I need to read all of this. So then she went and found me the shots of this from season 2. So Carl was one of those characters that like I could kind of see how he was related to Beth, but I was not entirely sure how it came together. His relationship to Judith as a caretaker in Alexandria, and then later how the role actually sort of falls on Negan. I'm thinking of the episode in which she lets him escape and gives him her compass, and then he comes back, and then he later saves her life in the storm. Judith sort of lives in Carl's image, though, while Carl was living in Rick's image. There is something important, I think, in the fact that Rick puts the hat on Carl, then the hat falls off Carl, and then Rick puts the hat on Beth. So I've already talked about like my interpretation of that, right? I think the fact that Rick puts the hat on both of them differentiates Carl and Beth from like Judith and RJ. And so she went back and found these shots, and he says, hey, I'm like you now. We've both been shot. I think I can make these big. Hold on. We've both been shot. Isn't that weird? And Rick says, you're in the club now. You get to wear the hat. Think about that. Interesting, right? Gladriel Jones is going to talk about it more here in a minute. And then he says, didn't you know? Like, as in, didn't you know if you've gotten shot, then you get to be in the club and wear the hat? And he puts it on him, right? And Carl says, won't you miss it? So Gladriel Jones says, the thing I love about this scene, and which I had totally forgotten, is that Rick tells Carl he's in the club now. He says, since you're in the club now, you get to wear the hat. Didn't you know? This makes it seem like Beth is in the club. Carl later survives another gunshot, this time in the literal head. It's almost like the hat is a protective symbol. Carl dies from the walker bite, not from a gunshot wound. He can't die that way because Rick didn't die that way. Then this. Won't you miss it? Maybe you let me borrow it from time to time. And then Carl says, we can share it. Carl asks if Rick will miss the hat or being the sheriff. They decide to share the hat. I think this is important because it communicates that the hat does in some way still belong to Rick. So when he tosses it on Beth's head, very similar to how he tosses it onto Carl's, this matters. Like handing down the crown, or I guess transferring the crown. Carl has to become something else, though, so that Beth can carry the mantle. Carl believes in a better world just like Beth did. This way, Beth can become a more complex heroine who is not morally coded just as a nurturer or a savior, but who can and will make hard decisions and sometimes mistakes. Carl dies trying to save Sadiq. Sadiq, as it turns out, is a doctor. The sort of proximity to Beth's death in a hospital feels like it also may matter. Anyway, I thought this was super interesting. Way too many coincidences. So then, this is not. She says it's unrelated to Carl, but I'm going to include it because it's about Rick. And I think that Rick's arc really intersects with Carl's in a big way. So bear with me here. Also, because I'm here, I had another random thought the other day, which is entirely unrelated to Carl, but related to surviving the gunshot wound. It's related to Coda and why the scene is shot the way it is. I put out a post about the 5 bedrock examples from TWD that Beth's death is abnormal. One of them revolves around the fact that Dawn shooting Beth is a physical impossibility, obviously. Someone commented in the replies that they never understood any of this and what actually happened or something like that. I remember how it's been discussed that the scene may just be from Rick's point of view. I thought about how when Rick was shot, he didn't see where the shot came from. Its source was concealed to him. Only later, when he was talking to Shane, did Shane tell him there was a third man. I also thought about Blair and Gina. Okay, Blair and Gina are Tales of the Walking Dead, if you don't know who that is, which I've been thinking about a lot lately. In the Blair Gina episode, there's a reference to morphic resonance, but there's also the reference to folie à deux, which is a psychiatric diagnosis that involves shared delusions between two people or more. Basically, there is a dominant personality, and they suck surrounding and more submissive personalities into their delusions. An in real life example of this is the Slender Man stabbing in Wisconsin like 10 years or so ago. One girl was fully delusional and legitimately believed Slender Man was calling upon her to sacrifice her friend. She had another friend who helped her in the stabbing who didn't have schizophrenia or any diagnosable psychiatric disorders, and yet she was fully sucked into the other more dominant girl's delusions. After time and separation, she gained clarity and was able to understand what she did. I wonder if this isn't what was, or say, sorry, I wonder if this wasn't what happened in Coda in a small oblique way. I wonder if maybe whatever Rick saw, it was so inexplicable, his mind blocked it out and filled in the blanks with something he understands, such as the near fatal gunshot coming out of nowhere from the third man. It's what happened to him, and maybe the situation was so traumatizing, whatever it was, that everyone who was there essentially just repressed it, or they shared in Rick's delusion that she was shot by Dawn, because their minds were malleable and fractured, and that's what makes sense. So it's so confusing and inexplicable, they just forget rather than try and suss out what went on. It becomes a shared delusion, a folie à deux, and maybe no one talks about it because no one knows what happened, or like they still don't understand it, so they forget. In What Happened and What's Going On, Tyrese, right before the governor tells him he has to pay the bill, tells him with conviction that he had been listening to the news. He knows what happened and what's going on. This could be, or this could add a new layer to the theory that Tyrese saw something. Maybe they all saw, but he was simply having a breakthrough in the moment before his death. I don't know what this could imply. Something much worse, perhaps. It could just be that the whole thing from the exchange to the escape was so messed up. Rick essentially forgot what happened and replaced it with something that made sense, and the rest just remains in erasure. Because it really doesn't make sense. that Beth would get murdered and Daryl would kill Dawn, and then Rick would just invite the rest of the group to come join his group and then leave with no retaliation or investigation at all into what happened. Almost like he was scared or like we didn't see what actually happened, just an impression of what happened. Anyway, I know this was a major digression, but if the hat is indeed a protective symbol, then my guess is actually that Beth did get shot. That part wasn't a delusion, but she wasn't shot by Dawn. She was probably shot by O'Donnell aiming for Dawn or the unseen third man. Maybe something else did go down. Maybe there was a shootout. I don't know. Maybe in all of this, she didn't die. They carried her out and saw signs of life after they put her in the car during the Walker attack, but it was too late to save her. They all rewrote that moment in their memory as indicating that she had turned because it was otherwise too much to take. They saw her banging on the glass from inside the car, but they couldn't get to her. They went back later and she was gone. Some characters like Tyrese and Daryl are more sensitive. They may have earnestly believed she was alive, but Rick wouldn't let Daryl go back. Too dangerous. Tyrese knows or dies knowing the truth, and in Beth's place, the sacrifice the narrative required. Daryl remains mad at Rick basically forever, and the two are never the same. Okay, we're gonna go forward with this, but something I actually just thought of when I was reading this that I hadn't thought of before. I was thinking O'Donnell died, presumably, um, because Dawn kicked him down the elevator shaft. But then it popped into my head that Daryl threw Beta down the elevator shaft and he lived. I have no idea if that is an actual tie, but that would be nuts if they thought O'Donnell was dead and he lived and climbed back up the elevator shaft and was trying to shoot Dawn and shot Beth. Whoa, that would be so gnarly. I don't know if that's what they're going for, but we do have two different people who were kicked down the elevator shaft. We never saw O'Donnell again. We thought he seemed to have died. Um, but then we see Beta didn't die. And if that were to be the case, O'Donnell would qualify as the unseen third man. Interesting. So, um, then she says, sorry if this is confusing. Um, I guess I'm wondering if basically everything we see is just Rick's delusion and the GA are in some way sucked into that delusion, the same as the rest of Team Family. The simplest explanation, Beth stabs Dawn, Dawn shoots Beth, Daryl shoots Dawn, they all leave. But then there's TD, aka Tyrese, listening to the news, opening their eyes, seeing what really happened and what's really going on. And we don't get the answers. Tyrese dies, whatever happened, it's not what we saw, and it died with him. So then I said it makes perfect sense. And I like it. In my mind, the crazier the explanation, the better of Coda. And I had never thought before the idea that maybe Tyrese dying might have meant some sort of truth that he wanted to tell the others died with him. Very interesting and sad. But I can totally see that Rick's delusion colored everything. In fact, in many ways, that delusion caused more than one death. Okay, so this is what I was kind of wanting to get to. We've talked plenty of times about how his anger, especially killing Officer Bob, may have been what made the whole exchange go wrong and resulted in Beth getting shot. I think I figured out something similar with Carl. In After, we see Rick falling into a deep sleep for 24 plus hours and Carl not able to wake him up. And that can't represent Rick going into the CRM because Carl was already dead by then. But when he can't wake Rick up, he ventures outside the walls of the house alone. And while he survives in season 4, that's when we get a lot of foreshadowing symbolism, including a major foreshadow of Carl's death. So once again, Rick is asleep, Carl leaves the house alone. That's when we get that death shot that then we do see again in season 8 to show that that part where the walkers attacked him was a foreshadow of Carl's death. So we have Rick being asleep, Carl leaves the house, and then Carl's death. That's what's being symbolized. So I think the idea is that Rick's anger and delusions, even in season 7, led to Carl going outside the walls alone, and that's when he was bitten, saving Sadiq. If Rick had gone with him or been more open to letting people in, that wouldn't have happened. So it's another tie between Beth and Carl, that both deaths, one real, the other fake, were caused by Rick's callousness. And then the Beth-Carl dynamic becomes a lot like the Beth-Tyrese dynamic in that one died but the other lived. So there's lots of interesting ties here. Okay, so all I'm saying is that okay, so if we go back, Carl was being super savage at the end of season 3, right? Rick became a farmer to try and regain Carl's humanity, which worked. But then he continued to be a farmer, and because he wasn't being as strong a leader as he could, The governor bulldozed the prison. They all lost their home. Herschel was killed. And, again, you can't 100% say that that wouldn't have happened any other way. I'm not saying we should be blaming Rick for that. But the idea is that he wasn't being as strong of a leader as he could have been. And if he had been, there's the possibility that maybe he could have stopped what happened or that it just would have gone differently. But after that, as I said, Rick waffled in a big way. So he went from being almost too docile to being not just strong, but very harsh and very savage and kill everybody kind of a mentality. And we've talked about plenty of times before how because he was that way, because he killed Officer Bob, that's what actually led to the problem in the exchange. Because if they had had Officer Bob, they would have had three people to exchange for two. Dawn could not have asked for Noah back. She wouldn't have had a leg to stand on any ground to ask for that because she was getting back three people and giving away two. And then Beth wouldn't have run to hug Noah and it might not have happened, right? But Rick's savagery does not end with Coda, okay? If you think about season five, he's very, oh, the Alexandrians are lucky we're here so that we can kill everybody for them. And we have, how he went after Jessie before her husband died. And it came across as really creepy at times, right? He was being kind of a creeper. And all of that, like it doesn't go away. And then we have them attacking the Savior's station, satellite station, which is a pretty callous, violent thing to do. They weren't being attacked; they were on the defensive or on the offensive, I should say, and they were being very violent. And it's not like it was only Rick. Daryl went through his really violent phase, and everybody was behind Rick in doing this. So they all were, but they were taking their cues from him because he was the leader. And then in All Out War, same thing. He was being very violent. He was saying, we're not letting people in. That was even in Operation Lead the Walkers Away. Remember him and Daryl talked about that and how they shouldn't let people in anymore. And Daryl disagreed. And Carl wanted to go out and help people. So again, if Rick had been more like Carl wouldn't have been out there alone to help Sadiq, and then he might not have been bitten, right? So it kind of goes back to what I was saying about Carl in After showing callousness, and then not until he actually cried and broke down and admitted what his true feelings were and dealt with his trauma did he get the miracle of Rick being alive. Well, Rick doesn't do any of that, right? At least not in seasons 4 through 8, right? He continues to be callous, but Carl dying, that was him losing his sunshine. That was him losing the person he was most concerned with, and that really broke him. But it also forced him to um, change the way that he was dealing with people. So that's when he finally stopped being brutal. And because Carl asked him to spare Negan, he did. Now, if Carl had not died, Rick would have probably remained in that callousness and he would have just killed Negan, right? So you could argue that what happened with Beth, her getting shot and being separated from the group, as well as Carl's death, was a direct result of Rick's callousness and his savagery, right? Not saying that he caused the death or that he's necessarily at fault for it, but just that if he had had a different attitude, things might have been different, right? Really interesting stuff. But it's a direct link, it's a direct sequence from, um, okay, Rick is being savage. That's why things go the way they did in Coda. That's why Carl gets bitten. That's why Rick spares Negan. And now Negan looks like he is going to be the catalyst to bring Beth back. And she will be for Maggie, of course, but also in some ways for Rick, something they lost that will be replaced or will come back through resurrection, right? So Gladriel Jones says, oh, interesting tie-in. I love the connection to Sadiq. Thank you for reminding me how to spell his name. And always, or after, meaning the episode, always felt weird, like Carl wandering outside the confines of the story in a way. Similar to Indifference, After takes place in like what appears to be a housing development, a suburban setting. The suburbs are a perfect liminal space metaphor, sort of like he's in the margins. So much of 4B feels this way, and when you put it like that, like as foreshadowing for Carl going outside the walls of Alexandria alone, which is another housing development, because Rick just can't wake up, then it calls a lot of other stuff in season 4 into question as almost being like pure metaphor. Of course, all of those things happen, but it is not as simple as what you see is what you get. So then we talk about it a little bit more. I'll read this part too. I just basically say that I think one of the big reasons that for season four was such a big hit with fans is because even though the events were real for the characters, it had a very mystical feel to it. And once we got to more concrete stuff that was from the comic books, that feel went away and people started having nostalgia for earlier seasons. And of course, I think the Daryl spinoff has recaptured a lot of that. Um, and that's why it's been such a hit. And of course, the fact that it's about specifically Daryl doesn't hurt. So um, then Galadriel answers, I can't remember who recently pointed out that season four is a major digression from the comics. Maybe this was okay, skip that part. The idea, I think, is that Gimple digressed from the comics in season four to establish his long-term plans. He then returns to the comics wholesale once they get to Alexandria. He only strays then in little swatches, with Jadis and her mysterious helicopter group, with Swear and Heath and the PPP card. Rick's disappearance used to open another, or Rick's disappearance used to open another door to the long term. A lot of people, I think, still wonder if this is true, then why is it still taking him several years to bring back Beth? I think, though, that this is solved by thinking about the big picture. To us, this is all about Beth. But to Gimple, Beth is just one part of it. Beth was the character whose death created the conditions necessary to initiate the storyline in the first place. But he had to resolve Rick's story first, which he has now through The Ones Who Live. He then had to resolve Carol's story. Carol has mostly let go of her dead as of Daryl Dixon season three, and her story is resolved mostly. These things came up in her absence, meaning Beth's absence, and are super important to the general audience. He has now resolved Rick and resolved Carol. Maggie and Daryl, and to a lesser extent Negan, remain. I think that it's important that he saved Daryl's and Maggie's stories for last because they are tied together by Beth. You can't resolve one without the other, and of course, everything takes time. The 6 episode arcs are so spare, and if you add it all up, the entirety of Daryl Dixon will be like 21 episodes long, or just 1.5 of the seasons of the show we used to know, because they used to have 16 episodes a season, right? The new format just protracts everything. I think, too, it's possible they knew about this AMC acquisition a long time ago, that it was in the works for years, that there may have been the fear that something would happen, that the franchise would be sold or get canceled, hence the protracted detour through spin-off land, and meanwhile, Gimple uses fabulous settings and plots and Norman's enormous star power for proof of concept. Maybe he was also waiting for the go-ahead on another flagship. All these things could account for why, like, Beth didn't come back the instant the flagship was over. And I said, yes, agreed, fantastic insight. Once again, this is one of my favorite parts of being on TD. It's hard to wait, but when things come together and click into place, chef's kiss. So then W.D. Way answered, I'm somewhat late to this conversation, but it's so interesting to read. I do have a few thoughts I wanted to share that I thought of while reading above. I have a Carl and Beth dialogue tie that I wanted to point out just in case you, Liesl, haven't reviewed the exchange. In season 2, and I'm sorry, I don't know the episode, but Shane and Carl are talking and Shane says, is that what you think? And Carl responds with, that's what I know. The same dialogue exchange happened between Beth and Daryl in episodes still during their fight scene. Now, you guys, this is really interesting. I always forget that. I mean, I've seen it before that dialogue parallel is there, but I always forget about it. I do not think that Gimple necessarily put this line of dialogue in season 2 in order to foreshadow Beth because he was not in charge then. But I do think this is another thing that he mined. So when he knew what he was going to do when he took over as showrunner, he knew this that we're discovering now, all of these ties and the sequence between Carl and Beth, we're just now discovering it. 12 years later, he knew about it when he took over the show as showrunner in season 4. And he went back and he found that dialogue from Carl and he put it into Beth and Daryl's arc so that there would be an entanglement there. This is what he does. Okay. So great job, W.D. Way, bringing that up. The next one is about Carl dropping his hat in the scene from A, and I agree with everything said above, but I have another symbolic meaning of what Rick says to Carl and what the sheriff's hat might represent. I don't know the exact wording, but I'll use what Tara had written about when the sheriff's hat falls off Carl. Rick, while picking up the hat, tells Carl he needs a new hat, a gardening hat. He then places the sheriff's hat on Beth and tells her she's the new sheriff in town. I'm thinking that Rick telling her telling these two characters okay, sorry, I'm reading that wrong. I'm thinking that Rick's telling these two characters their real direction in life. Beth will be the new sheriff, a person who is about law and order, but also, especially in Beth's case, a moral right and wrong character. One who's about to one who is about doing the right thing because it is the right thing to do. She will stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. For Carl, he will wear a gardening hat. A gardener, nurturing plants, people, represent a nurturer, which was more of Carl's role at Alexandria. He chose more of the path of gentleness. He nurtured his sister Judith. He cared for people. He was growing his garden. He did get the sheriff hat back and wore it until he gave it on his deathbed to Judith. But I want to point out the night that Alexandria was attacked, Carl wore his sheriff's hat and he became the sheriff of Alexandria. Once he got his community safe in the tunnels, then he went on guard to the community. Sorry, then he went on to guard the community. If I'm not mistaken, Carl drops the hat off his head again just as the phoenix emerges, and then he places his hat back on and continues being the sheriff of his community that he helped to grow. One more, I was reading the part about when we believe Beth was placed in the car at Grady and there was a commotion going on, and just like you, Tara, I've always thought that Beth might have woken up in the car and was hitting the glass windows, and Team Family saw this from a distance thinking she had turned into a walker. I really believe that Sasha, who was the marksman of the group, fired a shot into the windshield that could have possibly glazed Beth, and she passed out again. Sasha thinking she had put Beth down from being a walker, only later to find out that Beth's body had disappeared from the car, leaving a question of how, and probably leaving her sweater and belt behind. Okay, that's my thoughts. Okay, so that was a lot, and this ended up being a longer video than I thought it would be, but I said I wanted to do a deep dive into Carl because when I realized that about 100 different things clicked into place for me, and as we've gone back over arcs and rewatching a few episodes and things, as you can see, we're pulling a lot of pieces into place. So I just wanted you guys to see that. I wanted you to see what I'm thinking, what we're all thinking, and why it's so important, and especially to appreciate the fact that Gimple knew all of this about Carl back before season 4, and therefore he had to have known everything about Beth back then. And so for people to say that we're reading too much into it or that she would have been back by now, no, 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 no. Or that, they killed her off suddenly. People do that. They change their mind. Yes, it happens. Yes, they change their mind. Yes, things get canceled and plans change. But this is showing that what has happened has been exactly what Gimple planned to have happen. And maybe other things changed, nuances, details, taking longer than they thought it would, that sort of thing. COVID happened. Now they're filming abroad instead of here in Georgia. All kinds of details changed. But the arcs, the story they had planned, has remained the same as what they originally planned from the time Gimple took over as showrunner, which was actually technically the very end of season 3. Okay. And the thing is, Nicotero told us this. It was years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago. He made a statement, which to me was clearly addressing the Caroler hype and the fact that I think it had more to do with Carol and Ezekiel was happening in a big way back then. And the Carolers were having a hissy fit about it, right? And somebody asked Nicotero about this and, how much he was going to listen to the fans. And he said, that while he respected the fans' rights to believe whatever they wanted, that he and the writers were going to tell the story they had set up to tell, and basically they do not care what the fans think. And the reason that they can do that, you have to understand too, that not all shows can do that. If they have a very small fan base and then they alienate that fan base, then to the point where they're not getting views anymore, then they'll go off the air. So in some cases, they do have to pay attention to what the fans are saying. But The Walking Dead is not one of those. It's been going for 12 years. It has a huge fan base, lots of whom are not the carolers. I always like to say this, even though they're loud, they are a very small slice of the fandom, and the powers that be recognize that. This is not specific to Carl, but I want to remind you that just this last Comic-Con, there was something that really jumped out at me. It was just one of the interviews that the whole group was doing. They do the junkets and they have to sit all day for interviews from different news outlets. And I saw one that was shared on social media where the interviewer asked, how aware are you of fan theories and what fans are saying about the show? And Norman, without hesitation, without any kind of excusing it, he just said, oh, we are very aware. And then he just kind of moved on and continued answering the question, whatever else the guy had asked. But the point is, they are aware and they are still telling the story that they set up to tell. back in season 4 when Gimple took over. And I have just laid out a lot of proof for you about that, specifically about Carl's arc, but also how it intersects with Beth and with Negan and why they kept Negan alive. And because that's another choice that actually pissed a lot of fans off. Not so much as others, like people weren't nearly as mad about that as about Beth getting shot in Coda or about Glenn dying, but people wanted to see Negan get killed because that would have been justice for Glenn. But Gimple had a plan, right? He had to use Negan. Negan had more further to go. And now we're seeing where this is leading to. Okay, so I'm really going to shut up now. I've been talking for 90 minutes, and that's why I keep losing my voice. Um, so I hope you enjoyed this. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I would love to hear any other connections that you're making. This is super fun. And I will be back soon to answer more asks and YouTube comments. All right. Everyone have a wonderful day. And for heaven's sake, keep calm and Bethel on. Bye.